What's up everybody, it's Paul from Boosted Films, and in this video we're going to show how to install this EVO 8 reverse exhaust cam sensor housing. And this piece here is from Wunderladen Racing, and it's a pretty quality piece. I made a video about this part and a couple other parts, going into detail about them. I made a separate video about that, so I'll put a link to that in the video description down below if you want to learn more about this specific product. Before we jump into this full-length install video, I just want to give you some quick notes about this job. I did remove my valve cover to help release my OEM cam sensor housing. You technically don't have to remove yours to do this job, so just something to be aware of. I took my cam cap off too, just to make it easier to clean things up, and again, just to remove that OEM housing. So just be aware of that. And also be aware of this trigger plate here. A big part of this is that you need to flip this trigger plate. It can only go two different ways, but it's got a fat side and a skinny side, as you can see. And you need to pay attention to where that was when you first took your cover off, and then you'll have to flip it when you also flip the cam position sensor housing. So let's jump into it. Of course, the first step here is to release our hood. We're going to start removing some other old components here. You can see I have a heat shield covering up my original cam sensor here. And so I'm going to remove the hoses going to the valve cover, and I'm going to remove this heat shield. And I'll preface this, of course, by saying your setup could be different than mine. EVOs are obviously usually modified, so depending on your upper intercooler pipe, depending on your upper radiator hose, this process, of course, could be different for you. I will say just kind of be ready to remove your upper radiator hose and potentially your upper intercooler pipe. And I'll also start by saying right off the bat that I should have did that stuff sooner. I hadn't ever done this specific job before, and usually when I make how-to videos, I like to make a how-to video the second time I've done something. The first time off camera, so that's when I'm learning, and the second time I can show you exactly how I did it, and it goes a bit smoother. But I still felt like this was worth showing here, of course, even though there's a couple things that I did a little bit out of order, and I should have did a bit differently, but I'll cover them in the voiceover here. So now we're actually removing the actual cam sensor here, and there's just one bolt holding that on. So we're going to remove that one bolt, and then we're going to pull out the cam sensor. Next, I'm going to remove there's a ground wire that goes to this OEM cam sensor housing. I'm going to remove the bolt that holds that in place. Also going to note that we're going to relocate that ground wire later, and we're going to put it on that thermostat housing. And there are two bolts that hold this cam sensor housing to your cylinder head. So we're going to, of course, remove those two bolts on either side of this OEM cam sensor housing. And I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be able to get this out without removing the cam cap, as I mentioned earlier, that holds your exhaust cam down, that final cam cap that we're going to get to, but I could be wrong. As always, this is just me learning as I go and documenting as I go. So if you know better than me, leave a comment section down below. But anyway, to get to this other bolt, I had to use a swivel here. And again, I'm probably going to be a broken record on this. I should have removed the upper radiator hose already. I should have just did that right away, and probably that upper intercooler pipe as well. I think if you're doing this job, you might just want to have the mindset of taking those off right away, because it might just make everything easier anyway. Next, there are three bolts holding this cover on, and this cover now is kind of holding in the trigger. There's a trigger inside here that we're going to get to later that it's got kind of a blade, I guess, and that's what the sensor senses when it passes by to know the position of the cam. So this is important. I'm going to show you here. I'm going to cut to the future in a little bit here, but there's a fat side and a skinny side, as I'd like to call it, of this trigger, and you got to pay attention to that. So here I cut to the future and I pulled this out, and just so you can see the difference here. And this is what that trigger looks like, and as you can see, there's also some protruding parts where it sticks out. So this kind of can only go two different ways. But again, that's important. Just pay attention to the way this was when you are initially removing it. So like right now, I'm considering that fat side, that wide side, is closer to the firewall. And because we're flipping this, what we're going to want to do, since we're flipping where the sensor position is, what we're going to want to do on install is we're going to flip where that trigger plate is as well. So on the way back in, it's going to be reversed, so that skinny side of that trigger is going to be facing the firewall, as opposed to the way we took it out, where it was the fat side. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. So of course, all this fun stuff, I'm sure you're pretty mechanically inclined if you're watching this video to do all this yourself. So I'm going to speed through a lot of this process, but I'll talk through a couple tips too as well. But what I'm doing now is unplugging some stuff, and of course removing my valve cover, my spark plug beauty piece here, carbon fiber piece. I removed that, and now I'm removing everything else. The coil packs, I'm going to remove those. All the stuff you need to remove to get your valve cover off. And I'm also going to point out back here on this portion of the valve cover, this is where your crankshaft position sensor plugs in here, and it runs pretty tight over your valve cover, and you'll have to remove that from this mounting place. Of course, I already unplugged it, but then there's a piece where it kind of clips onto to hold it in place down here, which is very hard to show, but I do have a screwdriver here giving you an idea of where I kind of got in to squeeze it to release it. So if you're replacing your camshaft position sensor, you would have to be kind of doing this too. But here you go, I popped it free. Again, sorry I didn't actually show it on video. It's hard to show down in there. But here it is once it's released, and you can see kind of where you need to squeeze it to release it to get that free and off that piece that holds it on. Now it's time to loosen up all the bolts that hold the valve cover down, and a couple that hold that front timing belt cover to the front of the engine too, just so we can get that free. And this hose here that goes to the back of the valve cover, we're just going to loosen up that clamp and pull off that hose as well. Now with everything free, your valve cover should lift out of the way. Hopefully your gasket for your valve cover just stays to one end or another, either just the cylinder head or just the valve cover. I did this a while back, replaced the gasket here actually when I did cams and stuff. So my gasket for my valve cover stayed in my valve cover, which is nice. And then, just because I don't want any debris getting in my engine and we don't really need this all exposed, I just cover this up just to prevent any bigger pieces from getting in there. All right, back to this trigger part here. Again, just trying to show at least that there's a small section and a bigger section here. And again, the bigger section right now is facing the firewall. So to get access to this, I did finally smarten up and say, hey, I got to get this upper intercooler pipe at least moved out of the way a little bit to remove the bolt that's holding that trigger in place. There's just one bolt in there, 12 millimeter, and you're going to have to break that free. But I will also say, maybe it's just me, but I don't like the idea of the engine potentially turning over, when you're trying to break this free. Another reason I removed the valve cover. So as you can see here, I got a large wrench that I'm going to hold onto the camshaft just so I know it's not turning over too far. It's, again, not the end of the world as long as you're spinning the right direction that it would turn over. But of course, our main goal here is just to loosen up this nut. So I just held a larger wrench onto my camshaft while I broke this nut free. And of course, same process when I retorqued it. I just held that camshaft in place just to make sure it wasn't moving the engine over, fighting that battle of the engine turning over while you're just trying to tighten up a bolt. So as you can see here, I should have just removed that upper radiator hose. I still didn't do that yet. I'll get to it eventually. Hopefully you've already done that if you're trying to do this job. So once that trigger is free, you're going to have to, of course, take that out if you're, swapping in this housing to reverse it. And again, note those protruding parts there where you can tell it's only going to go one way or the other. You're going to want to make sure those are in all the way when you go to put this back together. You can tell when it drops in. Basically, when you're kind of pushing on this to put it back in, put a little gentle pressure on it and spin it, and while you're spinning it, you'll feel it fall into those spots. But back to trying to get this original cam sensor housing off, we're going to loosen up and remove the bolts for this cam cap that helps kind of hold it in place. And then I just had a rubber hammer. I give it a few taps to try to loosen it up a little bit. And then I also found a spot where you could insert a screwdriver, or better yet, a pry bar, just to kind of wiggle free that original cam sensor housing. Again, if you got a better way of doing this, please comment, let me know. But I will just say the way I did this, I definitely took my time. I just gave it very light pressure, wiggle, 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 you know, break it free a little bit here on this side, try to get on the other side, wiggle it a little bit there as well. So wherever you can get in there, just to give it gentle pressure, and take your time with this, because you don't want to be breaking anything, of course, in this process. So take your time, try to wiggle it free, and you should be able eventually to get it out. I will note too that the cover is back on here, of course, because I just kind of swung that cover out of the way. That's why you can see that cover's back on, but that is our OEM piece. And here's a comparison. That's our sensor at the top, of course, and then on the left side here is our OEM piece, and on the right side is our Wunderladen reverse piece. So now that sensor is going to be facing towards the firewall of the car instead of towards the front of the car. I will say this is a quality piece. Everything fit great. I was very happy with the way this went. Of course, it comes with an O-ring, so we need to install actually 2 O-rings, but this first one here we're going to install and put on our new cam sensor housing here. And again, because I was too stupid to remove my radiator hose yet, I put the trigger plate, or the trigger piece, in there ahead of time because I knew it would be hard to get in there with that upper radiator hose in the way. So I put that in while I set this whole piece in place. And I should mention, of course, too, I think I did a little cleaning off camera. If there's any gunk, if there's any extra stuff in there from your old cam sensor housing, gasket material, you probably want to clean that up. Try to get this as clean as possible before you put the new sensor housing in place. So now we're going to get to the bolts. This flush bolt here goes towards the firewall side, more towards the back of the car, if you will. I accidentally or initially put in like the OEM bolt holding the front part of the one of the 2 bolts holding it in place. So I'm going to swap that one out in a second. But here we go. This, just so you're aware that the flush one, since that sensor is now towards the back of the car, you want this flush bolt back there. And again, good design, kind of needed, I guess, but you need that flush one back there so that sensor can fit. And these have more of an Allen head to them as well. So instead of using your wrench or a socket on these, you're going to have to use an Allen wrench. And now I'm just removing that OEM front bolt, and I'm going to put in the one that came with this Wunderladen piece. So you need a little bit more patience to do these. Of course, it takes a little bit more time with an Allen wrench to get them, but it is a nice looking piece. And after all, a lot of this is for looks, to make it look nice. But of course, we are also trying to remove that sensor itself from so much heat that these engines like to put off, and being closer to the exhaust manifold side, which it would be, you know, originally closer to the exhaust, and now we're pushing it back a bit. So we're going to tighten those bolts up, or at least get them close to tight. I don't think I actually torqued them down quite yet. And then I'm going to put these cam bolts back in place. Cam cap bolts, I guess I should say. And you will probably see I have the trigger the wrong way yet. I didn't, for whatever reason, I even spaced on flipping it initially. I did flip it eventually, but you're going to see, you know, my trigger right now should be flipped still. The fat side is closer to the firewall, and it should be the skinny side, if you will. So now just take your time. You're going to have to tighten up those 2 bolts that hold the actual sensor housing in place. And also, of course, you're going to tighten up those cam cap bolts as well. And I'm going to cut ahead a little bit to the future when I finally was like, oh yeah, I need to flip that trigger. So just showing you now that I'm going to loosen it up because it's still actually currently wrong. And you can see I have that upper radiator hose off to make this a bit easier here. Eventually we did flip this trigger, so it was rotated 180 degrees from when we initially took it off. All right, so again, with that trigger, though, just make sure as you're giving that trigger pressure, when you're pushing it back onto the camshaft, you can feel it, you'll feel it drop into place. So make sure you kind of feel that drop into place. I would suggest trying to hold that trigger in place while you then tighten it up with your fingers, or if you have something else to get in there to obviously tighten it. But You just want to make sure it stays in those slots where it drops in while you tighten it up. And then if you got a second pair of hands, I don't think it moves very much, but you torque this to about 16 foot-pounds. I did a little bit extra. I think I did 17 or 18 pounds just because I had that extension on my, ratchet there. But I had someone else hold the camshaft for me just to make sure it didn't move. And then, of course, we're tightening up that camshaft cap as well. I believe, if I remember right, these are 15 foot-pounds. I have a whole video about doing camshaft install if you want to check that out. If you want more torque specs, I advise you just kind of check out all the torque specs, find them yourself just to verify. But being the person I am, after I torqued down that one we replaced, or removed, I should say, I just double-checked all my cam caps while I was in there. All right, now I'm just going to clean up the area where the valve cover went down, try to get any excess oil off where that gasket sits, and then set my valve cover back down because we did a lot of the hard stuff now, and we're going back the assembly direction, which is good. If you've never installed an EVO valve cover before, or torqued one down, I should say, if you check the torque specs on these, again, I don't have them off the top of my head right now as I'm recording the voiceover, but it's very, very light. So I would just say walk yourself around when you tighten these slowly but surely. Don't just torque one down and then go start the other one. Take your time to slowly walk all these down in place, and don't over tighten them because usually that's what ends up causing a leak. So now we're back up towards the firewall and above the valve cover here. As we mentioned, this crankshaft position sensor plug-in here sits on a mounting point. So we're just going to push that back down in place. And then, of course, we're going to plug this back into the wiring harness here. We're going to plug in our crankshaft position sensor. And then you need to run the other wires, of course, to put your coil packs, plug those back in, and an oxygen sensor plug-in, I believe, is one of these plug-ins too. So, of course, anything you unplugged, you're going to want to plug it back in. So we're back to reinstalling everything else here. So I'm going to put my upper intercooler pipe back in place now that we have that trigger torqued down. Any clamps you removed or loosened on your intercooler piping, make sure you tighten those up. And then we're going to reconnect the hose that runs to our intake pipe here from our valve cover to our intake. We're going to reconnect that. All right, so here's our cam sensor itself. And as you can see now, this is going to come in from this side here. And this is one of the disadvantages of this. Here's the bolt that holds that sensor in place. It does make this harder to get to, of course, because now it's facing towards the firewall. So actually tightening this down is a bit tricky. I had a swivel, I had an extension. Getting into this spot is tough because it's so close to the neck of that radiator outlet here. But just be aware of that. Of course, not everything's going to be easier when you're flipping this. So that's one kind of drawback of that. And now we got the cover for this Wunderladen piece. Again, it fits, these bolts are ARP, they sit flush. It's a pretty good solid piece here. So what we're gonna do, of course, is put the O-ring gasket in place as well. So I put that on the housing itself before I put this cover on. And then I just decided, this is actually when I finally really decided to remove the upper radiator hose here. So I put the top two bolts in place, and I could not get to the bottom one without removing that radiator hose. So be prepared for that. Fluid will come out, of course. Have your catch can ready to catch some of that antifreeze, but there won't be that much. So it's not a whole lot that comes out, but just be ready to remove that to get to the final bolt, that bottom bolt of this cover. Also, if you're doing it like I did, you'll see eventually that I made sure the cover was actually on, at least with the two bolts before I removed that upper radiator hose, just to, make sure we don't want any coolant in our engine where it's not supposed to be. So to prevent it from getting into that cam sensor housing, I should say, I made sure the cover was on. But now I'm tightening up all three of those bolts. Now that I have the radiator hose out of the way, I'm tightening up the bolts on the cover to tighten that up. And then we can put our radiator hose back in place. And of course, we're going to plug in the plug-in that goes to our cam sensor itself. So we're going to plug that in. And of course, note the ground wire. We have excess wire in general back here now because we don't need to run it as far. So however you want to kind of tuck that is up to you. But as I mentioned, this ground wire here, we're going to move to this one thermostat bolt that you can see right now, kind of underneath or in between the upper intercooler pipe and the battery. So I'm going to remove that bolt. I'm going to clean up that area a little bit as well, try to make sure it has good contact. And then what's nice about this relocating it here is it does fit right. It's kind of the right bolt size to just take that ground wire. Should fit right on the bolt, and then you put that bolt in place and tighten it back down. And that's about it. If you notice some inconsistencies again in the edit with things changing around, that's because I wanted to change this in a way that made more sense for you, and also because it was my first time doing this particular job, and I didn't do everything in order always either like I wanted to. But of course, the final step, what I recommend you do is once you have everything double checked, make sure you got everything reconnected. You can start your car and let it run, make sure it runs fine, and watch for any leaks. Make sure there's nothing leaking, any big oil leaks, any coolant leaks. Obviously, you want to double check all that stuff before you kind of take it for a test drive. But that's about it, everybody. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please leave a thumbs up. If you did like it, if it was helpful, you can, give the video a thumbs up or whatever. And of course, I'm always open to improving my process, and hopefully, a lot of the EVO community here is pretty smart. So if you guys found a better way of doing something, or if you have some tips, go ahead, leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what I could have did better. Let me know what worked better for you, if you did this particular process. And again, this is a Wunderladen piece. I'll link to their website as well in the video description if you want to check them out and get yourself this reverse cam housing. But as always, this is Paul from Boosted Film saying thanks so much for watching.